What's up guys, Sagi here and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today we're going to check out the Canon G7X Mark III. Canon's goal is to create a camera for someone who's looking to take their smartphone vlogging or picture taking skills to another level. But did they succeed, and is the G7X the right camera for you to buy? Let's take a look. On the surface, the camera has a lot going for it, and I'm going to walk you through a full review and then my decision-making process about whether I think it's a good option. The G7X Mark III is the next iteration of the extremely popular Mark II, and it addresses some of the major pain points that existed with the previous model. A few of the most noteworthy items are 4K video, an external mic input, and 1080p at 120 frames per second for slow motion. But together with these enhanced specs, there are also some real head scratchers. So I'm going to cover what I liked and what I didn't like about the G7X Mark III, and ultimately try to come to a conclusion about who this camera will work for. I'm going to very quickly go over some overall key features in case you're just starting your research. The G7X Mark III has a decent quality body. It's a bit plasticky, but for the most part it's covered with this rubber grip, and the moving elements are made of metal. It has a 20.1 megapixel stacked 1-inch CMOS sensor and uses the new Digic 8 processor to help with operating speed, performance, and overall image quality. Canon reports that the stacked sensor is designed to offer quick focusing speeds, although that wasn't always my experience. It has a 3-inch 1.04 million dot LCD touchscreen, and it can internally record 4K 30 frames per second and 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. It has a super versatile 4.2x optical zoom lens, which offers an equivalent focal length range of 24 to 100 millimeters and has image stabilization built in. The lens has a very nice maximum aperture of f1.8 at the wide end and 2.8 at the telephoto end, which makes it a great option for low light and for getting shallow depth of field. It can shoot continuously at up to 20 frames per second and has an expandable ISO of up to 12,800. And finally, it has an external mic input for better audio and a clean HDMI out for additional recording options. Alright, so when you look at the specs and you consider that the G7X Mark III costs around $750, this seems like it's an unbeatable deal. But things are not always as they appear, and this is why I make sure that I use a camera for a while before publishing a review. The G7X Mark III is the official replacement of the super popular Mark II, and at first glance they appear to be practically identical. But the sensor on the Mark III is a 20.1 megapixel stacked 1-inch CMOS sensor. And in case you care, a stacked CMOS sensor increases the readout speed of the data by dedicating a layer to collecting the image data and then another layer to processing that data. And if you're still awake after that sentence, for its size, the sensor is a good option if you're doing street photography, shooting landscape, photographing your family, or if you're looking for a great travel camera. And like with the G5X Mark II, I was very happy with the images. Color processing was great, and the overall image processor was good. Again, considering the size of the sensor and the camera. Moving on to the processor, the G7X Mark III uses the newer Digic 8 processor that we saw on the M50, the EOS RP, the EOS R, the SL3, and the G5X Mark II. The sensor does contribute to the overall operating speed of the camera, and the G7X Mark III startup, going from shooting to preview mode and back to shooting, and just in and out of the menu and changing settings, it's always felt very fast, and the camera's been really responsive. As far as video goes, the sensor and processor combined to offer full sensor readout 4K 30, meaning that there's no additional crop. And for slow motion, we can shoot at 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. Canon is definitely targeting creators with these specs, and while the camera technically can do those things, I'll leave it for now by saying there's more to it. I'll get into this more in a later section, but I was getting pretty good 4K video with nice detail and relatively good dynamic range. Now back to the processor. For photography, I can shoot at up to 20 frames per second burst or continuous shooting, which is pretty impressive. So I can just hold down the shutter and the camera will just keep on firing. Yeah, I just took a lot of shots. This is a nice feature if you're photographing your kids running around, if you're at a basketball game or a soccer game or any sporting event, or anytime when you're shooting fast moving subjects. Now 20 frames per second is in single shot autofocus, and the rate drops to 8 frames per second if you want to use continuous autofocus. But overall, I think 20 frames per second is a ton, gives you a lot of options to select from later on. Moving on, I say this in every video, but one of the most important things for me with any tool that I use is ergonomics in terms of handling and functionality. And it's something that I think is overlooked by a lot of people when they're choosing a camera. And the G7X Mark III is, by design, a super compact camera. It weighs under a pound and it fits in the palm of my hand. And this makes it an excellent travel and street photography camera because I can easily put it in my pocket and go. And while it is small, Canon did a good job of adding the rubbery grip material wherever possible. And for this size, the front grip is actually pretty good. And there's an area that jets out on the back where your thumb goes. So good job, Canon. I didn't see any mention of weatherproofing or even moisture or dust resistance, so I didn't push it and I made sure that I kept it dry. Now, G7X Mark III uses the NB13L battery, and it's rated for 235 shots with the screen on and 320 shots in eco mode. I was really hoping that Canon would use a more powerful battery here, and it definitely felt like it ran out faster than I wanted it to. Canon does include a charger, which is nice, and you can also charge the battery in camera with a USB-C cable, and thank you, Canon, for using USB-C. Ultimately, I would definitely have to get additional batteries if I plan on doing any kind of prolonged shooting, or I could bring a portable charger to be able to constantly replenish the battery. As far as buttons and dials, I'm happy with what you get with the G7X Mark III, considering the amount of real estate that Canon had to work with. The top of the camera features a mode dial to help you quickly change shooting modes, and an exposure compensation dial for additional control over your exposure. You can use the rear dial and the control ring on the front for aperture and shutter speed, and there are also dedicated buttons for focus mode, drive mode, display, and flash options. In the center of the control dial in the back, we can find the Q button, which will display the quick control screen. And it's also used to confirm selected settings. Canon's quick control screen is one of my favorites of any brand, and I find that I can easily make changes to practically any setting that I need without having to go into the menu. And combining the quick control screen with full touchscreen capabilities, which we'll talk about later on, made this camera super easy to use. Now, one cool feature which I hope a lot of other manufacturers start implementing is that you can now start and stop recording using the touchscreen. Now, this may seem like a small feature, but the record button on the back is kind of small, and when the screen is facing me, it's great to be able to just tap the screen to start and stop recording. On the right of the camera, we find a USB-C input, HDMI out, and the Wi-Fi button. Now on the left of the camera, we have the flash trigger and a 3.5mm external mic input. Now moving on to the bottom of the camera, we have the battery compartment and the SD card slot. Now that I covered the manual controls, I want to talk a little about the menu system, which I think is important because it's fundamental to how you interact with the camera. The good news here is that this has been a Canon strength for years, and the menu is super simple to use. You can access the menu by hitting the menu buttons on the bottom right, and everything is broken down into convenient sections. We have shooting settings, playback settings, wireless settings, function settings, and my menu, which lets you save commonly used menu items in one place so you don't have to spend any time looking for them. The menu system is very easy to navigate with either the control dial on the back or using the touchscreen. Overall, I was very happy with how easy the G7X Mark III was to use while acknowledging the limitations of a smaller body. Next, I want to talk about resolution, frame rates, and image quality. For stills, the G7X Mark III has a maximum resolution of 5472 by 3648, which I always think again is plenty for what most people using this type of camera would ever need. It can of course record both JPEG and RAW, so you can decide which one you want or both depending on what you plan on doing with the images in post-production. I wasn't sure what I was going to get from a 1-inch sensor, and I was surprised at the quality of the JPEGs. Overall, it performed quite well, even in lower light situations, in no small part due to the wide maximum aperture. For video, the G7X Mark III can record 4K at 30 frames per second and Full HD or 1080p at 30, 60, and 120 frames per second. In PAL, you can shoot 4K 25 and Full HD at 25, 50, and 100 frames per second. So this is where things start to fall apart. Like right off the bat, we don't have any option for 24 frames per second, not in 4K and not in 1080p. And I know for a fact that this is going to be a deal breaker for some users. 24 frames per second has been the standard for getting a more cinematic look, and I'll link up to a tutorial that explains this in more detail up in the corner and in the description. And this is continuing a very strange trend by Canon. I first saw this on the RP and then the SL3, and I was thinking that maybe they were just having this decision-making meeting on a Friday afternoon and people just wanted to get out of the office and they just didn't add the feature. Because I can't really think of any good reason why this feature would be missing, and I haven't heard it explained by Canon. Now, Canon has never tried to win the specs war, and in the past they've relied on continuing to do what they do well. But removing a feature that people love and has been around on essentially every camera for I can't even think of how many years is like the oddest move. Moving on from that temper tantrum, if you're shooting 4K 30, then you're getting the full sensor readout and the footage is oversampled with good results. There's also no additional crop being applied like we see on the SL3, M50, RP, or EOS R, but we are starting with a smaller sensor. There's also a 10-minute recording limit when shooting in 4K, and there are some overheating issues I'm going to discuss later on in this section. Going to 1080p, there are a lot more options. You can shoot at 30 or 60 frames per second, and then the recording limit moves up to the standard 30 minutes. The quality of the Full HD or 1080p isn't as good as the 4K, of course, and if you're editing in 1080p and want to get the absolute best footage, you can still shoot in 4K and then downscale it to 1080p in post. You'll definitely see sharper footage with more detail if you choose to do this, but then as I always say, you have to deal with 4K footage. But if you're willing to do that, again, it's worth the quality. Now let's get to 120 frames per second, which I was really excited about and is one of the reasons why I decided to add a couple of Sony cameras to my lineup. If you've watched my reviews, you know that I love slow motion, and this has been something that just hasn't been available from Canon in a consumer level camera at 1080p. So yes, technically the G7X Mark III can shoot 1080p at 120 frames per second if you enable high frame rate mode, which will slow your footage in camera. But you're losing autofocus, losing image stabilization. So if your camera or subject are pretty still, or if you're not really changing the focus distance, this can work for you. And 120 frames per second is gonna look more stable anyways because the movements are slowed down. But the lack of autofocus is not great, especially when I introduce camera movement and when I'm following a subject. Moving on to a video feature that I like, I wanna talk about in-body time-lapse. And this is a feature, again, that I absolutely love and I use all the time in the Canon cameras that offer it. We have two options for resolution, 1080p and 4K. And I would definitely recommend shooting this in 4K because of the added flexibility that it offers in post-production. Canon made this very simple. You just select the interval in seconds, which is how long you want to wait between each exposure. You then select how many exposures you want the G7X Mark III to take, and this will control how long your final time-lapse video will be. Finally, you select whether you want the camera to expose for each shot or keep the exposure setting from the first shot and use them for all subsequent shots. What's great about this is that you don't need to take individual photos and then process them yourself in post. When the camera is finished taking pictures, it will compile the time-lapse for you and it's ready to be viewed. I now want to get to the overheating issue that I experienced with this camera. After recording about 18 minutes of 4K footage, I got the overheating indicator light. And then once I got to 20 minutes, the camera wouldn't record 4K at all, and I got the message to turn off the camera to cool faster or use a lower movie quality setting. Now, in all fairness, this isn't a camera that I would get if I was planning on shooting long 4K clips, but since 4K is a feature that Canon is highlighting, I think the 10-minute limitation plus the overheating issues are definitely something that you should consider. In 1080p, I recorded for well over an hour with no issues. Next, the G7X Mark III has a clean HDMI out, so you can use it for live streaming or you can record externally. A clean HDMI out means that you won't see any of the menu overlays when you connect the camera to a capture card or to an external recorder. And this means that you can have a clean image and still use autofocus when you're streaming, which is something that wasn't available on the Mark II or on cameras like the SL2 or M50 unless you use special software. You also have the option to stream directly to YouTube using a Canon Image Gateway account. All right, next let's talk about autofocus, which has always been a strong suit for Canon. If you've watched any of my Canon reviews, you've already heard of the Canon Dual Pixel autofocus. It's one of my favorite autofocus systems on the market, and it's outstanding for both photography and video. Well, the bad news is that Canon did not include the dual pixel autofocus with the G7X Mark III, and instead we get a contrast detection system. Now, without boring you with the details, it's just not as good. And this was the first time using a Canon camera where I was disappointed by the autofocus system. For photos, I would sometimes get the green focus indicator and beep, even though the item behind the focus point was clearly out of focus. For video, it was pretty inconsistent. There are times when it worked fine, and then times where it would take a few seconds for it to get focus. Sometimes it would even detect a face, but then still for a few seconds, it wouldn't be in focus, which was very annoying. There are options for standard focus, macro focus, and manual focus, and it's nice that focus peaking is included, but I expect better autofocus functionality from Canon. All right, let's move on to the lens of the G7X Mark III. Now, naturally, being a point and shoot camera, we don't have the option to use interchangeable lenses, but the lens on this camera is really good. The focal length range is the 35 equivalent of 24 to 100 millimeters, which covers wide angle to short telephoto fields of view. Another strength of this lens is the maximum aperture range of f1.8 to f2.8, which helps when working in challenging low light situations and gives us the ability to work with shallow depth of field. The lens also includes an image stabilization system that's designed to minimize the appearance of camera shake in various shooting conditions. And there are settings for low, standard, and high levels of image stabilization. In addition to image stabilization, there's an auto level feature which is designed to keep the horizon leveled. The lens worked really well for me, and I was very happy with the different looks that I could get from such a small setup without having to change lenses. Moving on, let's talk a little about the screen, which is another strength of the G7X Mark III, and we have a 3-inch 1.04 million dot flip touchscreen. In order to have a super compact design, Canon opted for a flip screen instead of a fully articulating screen like on the M50 or the SL2. It can be tilted down so you can look at it if the camera is mounted above your head or if you're shooting over a group of people. If you're shooting from the hip or anytime when you're above the camera, you can tilt the screen up, and then it can be flipped all the way up to face the front so you can see yourself when you're in front of the camera. I like this simple hinge mechanism a lot better than what I have on my A6400, and it creates a much more compact solution. And going back to ergonomics, this is where being able to control essentially all of the settings of the camera using the touchscreen is a bonus. I can change aperture, shutter speed, focus point and mode, white balance, and essentially everything else I need without having to mess around with the control ring, the dials on the back, or any of the buttons. And I can also start and stop recording without having to fish for the record button. In this last section, I want to talk about other features that the G7X Mark III has that could help you make a buying decision. First, I want to talk about audio, where one of the biggest advantages the G7X Mark III has over the Mark II is that Canon added an external mic input. So instead of having to use the on-camera microphone, we can now attach an external microphone like a shotgun mic or a lavalier mic and get significantly better audio. You'll notice that there is no hot shoe because the G7X Mark III is so small, but I essentially have 3 different setups where I get fantastic audio from this camera. So I'll link to that tutorial up in the corner and in the description. And in the meanwhile, here's a sample of audio directly from the G7X Mark III microphone. So here's an audio sample recording right into the G7X Mark III. I'm sitting about 2-3 feet away from the camera, and this room is pretty well treated. So this should give you an idea of what recording directly into the camera is going to sound like in a quiet environment. And here I am using an external microphone. And now I went ahead and connected a Rode VideoMic Pro Plus right into the 3.5mm jack. I am using the plus 20 dB option, and this will give you sort of an idea of the type of audio you can get directly from the G7X Mark III versus what you can get by using an external mic. I'll put links in the description to a few options that I think would pair up well with the G7X Mark III, as well as a microphone comparison video I did to help you choose. Next, I want to talk about the built-in ND filter. And this is something that many people aren't familiar with, and I want to quickly explain why this is such a great feature. Essentially, what an ND filter does is it reduces the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. And you might not know why you would ever want to do that. So here are a few examples, and I explain this with samples in my cinematic look tutorial. So I'll link to that video up in the corner and in the description because I don't want this review to get even longer. So the first example is for video where we know that our shutter speed needs to be twice that of our frame rate. And when you want to shoot with the aperture wide open, let's say at f1.8 to get shallow depth of field, and then you go outside in bright sunlight, you're gonna have too much light. Next, there may be times where you want longer exposure for photography. Maybe you wanna introduce motion blur, and you don't want to close down the aperture. In both of these situations, it's super handy to have the camera do this for you without needing an actual filter. And on the G7X Mark III, there is a simple ND on-off option in the quick menu that takes care of this for you. Now let's move on to connectivity. The G7X Mark III also has built-in Wi-Fi, which lets you easily pair the camera with a smartphone or tablet using the Canon Camera Connect app. You can wirelessly share images and movies. This is awesome for when you're doing a shoot or you're just out on a hike or doing some street photography and you want to quickly post a great shot to Instagram or Facebook. You can just transfer it right to your phone, edit it, and then post. And with Bluetooth, you can both share images and control the camera remotely using the app. And that's huge when you're working alone. You can literally just use your phone as a remote control and monitor. There's a slight delay and it sometimes lags, but it's an awesome feature and I use it all the time when I'm working alone. Now, one of my favorite things is that I can see the focus point, change it, or even change the focus modes, which is something that I haven't always been able to do with other brands. For photography, I like this feature for macro photography, so I can take a picture without having to touch the camera and potentially introduce some shake. Okay, so it's hard for me to make a final decision about the G7X Mark III because it has some positive and at the same time some pretty glaring negatives. To recap, I like how small and portable it is. The image quality is pretty good. I really like the focal length range and the maximum aperture and image stabilization on the lens. I love how easy it is to use, the built-in time-lapse and ND filter, the touchscreen and quick menu functionality is fantastic, and the flip screen is great when I'm in front of the camera. On the other hand, there's no dual pixel autofocus, there's a 10-minute recording limit in 4K, no option at all for 24 frames per second, 120 frames per second has no autofocus, and there are overheating issues. Right now, the G7X Mark III sells for $750, and I'm super curious to know what you guys think about the feature set and the value. So please let me know in the comments section. There are a lot of cameras from Canon at or below this price point that I feel are better values. So let's get that discussion going in the comments section. I'll put links in the description to the G7X Mark III and some accessories that I like because there are always specials and discounts, and the links will automatically be updated with the lowest pricing. I really hope I was able to give you a good overview of the Canon G7X Mark III. If I did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. And you know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.